Do we control our government, or does our government control us? If we want to grab control back, assuming we don't have control, should we vote for Democrats to achieve that? If we feel out of control now under a Republican president, would a Democratic president make us feel more in control of our government and what our country does? If, for example, our country is an international bully and we want to stop that, would we be better off with Democrats or with Republicans? Or was George Carlin right all along, and the only reason they let us vote is to give us the illusion that we have a choice? Who's steering this ship anyway? What if neither Republicans nor Democrats are steering, but the plutocrats who own the Democrats and the Republicans are steering? If that's the case, there are only a few ways we can use our influence to control what's going on. To control the government, we would need to control the owners of the government. And as of right now, you and I are not in that big club. So we either buy our way in or we use other forms of leverage. And the only kinds of leverage that have ever worked in the past for us workers are strikes and protests. So far, at least, that's been the only way to get the attention of the plutocrats. But I submit that this time around, we need to do more than FDR did. We not only need to get their attention, we need to take power away from them permanently. The theme of today's show is, what does a vote for Joe Biden get you? And you can extrapolate and say, what does a vote for Democrats get you? At this point, a vote for Democrats gets you about the same thing that a vote for Republicans gets you. And what it gets you is nothing, but what you give away is the point. You are putting your stamp of approval on the oligarchic machinations. In short, you are consenting to be abused by the oligarchs. You're putting your stamp of approval on everything they do in your name. The Democrats have turned their backs on their own timid, mealy-mouthed proclamations of concern. That's what a vote for Democrats gets you. This article is from popularresistance.org. It's by Margaret Kimberly, and it's called Democrats' Climate Change Lies. The Republicans lie about the harm they do to the planet, and the Democrats lie and pretend they're not doing the very same things. In recent weeks, a combination of drought and record-breaking heat have accelerated wildfire season to historic levels of devastation. More than 4.6 million acres have burned in the states of California, Oregon, and Washington. Skies are colored orange and red. The air is unbreathable. Lives have been lost and entire towns have been destroyed. The connection between heat waves, droughts, and human-made climate change are clear, and the solution is known to every school child. There must be a drastic reduction in the production of fossil fuels. A radical restructuring of society, especially an end to capitalist incentives for planetary destruction, is no longer optional. Every form of plant and animal life is in very grave danger. It is easy to blame Donald Trump, who, among other things, famously withdrew from the 2015 Paris Climate Accords. Although it must be pointed out that the agreement is an honor system-based declaration of intent and not a requirement to take action. Signatory nations chose goals for themselves while also allowing temperature increases that are deadly for people living in the global south. The agreement specifically states that industrialized nations don't have to pay compensation for the damage they do to the rest of the world. Trump's stunt gives the impression that Democrats are serious about fighting climate change, but the facts prove otherwise. Barack Obama recently took to Twitter with photos of orange California skies and implored voters to act. Protecting our planet is on the ballot. Vote like your life depends on it, because it does. He didn't say who voters should support. One assumes he meant the Democrats, but they have turned their backs on their own timid, mealy-mouthed proclamations of concern. The Democratic National Committee removed language from its platform which called for ending government subsidies to fossil fuel companies. That betrayal was just as well, because the Democrats' record on the environment is nothing like the image they project on social media. Obama was joined by California's Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom, who used some of the same photos and offered the same platitudes with capital letters for extra emphasis. Climate change is real, so please vote! Obama and Newsom are both liars. This is what Obama said in a March 22, 2012 speech. Now, under my administration, America is producing more oil today than at any time in the last 8 years. That's important to know. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. Holy fucking shit. Newsom is no better. Despite the social media rhetoric, his administration continues to give fracking and other drilling permits. In fact, the state of California has given more fracking permits in the first 6 months of 2020 than it did in the same period the year before. Neither of the two capitalist parties is in any position to stop the planet from heating up. That is because both do the bidding of the corporations causing the record-breaking temperatures to occur. One party lies about the damage it is causing and promotes easily dismissed quackery to defend itself. As usual, the Democrats sneer and pretend to act differently when at every opportunity they do the very same things that are killing the planet. Our lives do depend on bringing about change, but that won't happen if Biden is the man in the White House. Supposedly, progressive Democrats stole the language of the Green Party, the party they otherwise scorn, and claim they will institute a Green New Deal. But the Democrats who promote a watered-down version are openly thwarted by their leadership. Their progressive wing is not serious, and the establishment doesn't even pretend until the West Coast is ablaze, and then pretense is all they have. Climate change did not begin after Donald Trump was inaugurated. The damage was done by Democrats and Republicans, by the United States, and by every industrialized nation that bowed to the dictates of capital. Obama and Newsom and all the rest hope we aren't paying attention when their handiwork produces a natural disaster. Pretending that one wing of the duopoly will behave differently than it has in the past is adding insult to one's own injury. The least we can do is call out the scoundrels when they tell us lies as the sky turns red. Here's another example of what a vote for Biden will get you. This is a Counterpunch article, The Leahy Laws, Why Biden's Promise to Israel is Illegal, by Zarefa Baroud. While co-hosting an interview on the Palestine Chronicle, I asked Dr. Richard Falk, former UN Special Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights, about his thoughts on Kamala Harris's promise to maintain unconditional aid to Israel. This is what he said. I am disappointed, of course, by the Harris-Biden positions on Israel. I would have hoped for something closer to what Bernie Sanders was saying as a way of shifting the policies closer to what I think a majority of American people would support and want, Dr. Falk stated. Again, it illustrates this disparity between the will of the people and the will of the governing elites. I don't think we can be very hopeful, possibly on the annexation issue, but I am not very optimistic that there will be any changes. So this is me talking again. Who controls the government? The imperialistic oligarchs control the government. You have owners. They own you. They own all of us. They dictate foreign policy. They dictate economic policy. And they dictate ecological policy. Back to the story. This presidential election cycle has given American voters once again a choice. The lesser of two evils. What a choice. It's an illusion of choice. Yet, in this election, it is particularly difficult to differ between the two candidates, especially their attitudes toward the Israeli occupation and American responsibilities towards the former, being their military's largest sponsor. Notably, the progressive Biden does not have a discourse which is more developed than his conservative opponent. In July, he ordered the removal of any reference to the Israeli occupation from his campaign platform in July, in contradiction with international recognition of Israel as a belligerent occupation. Progressive Americans, if there are such things, organized against the Trump administration for his frequent violations of constitutional law and lack of human rights standards, domestically and internationally. Many have missed that Biden has already committed to campaign promises which guarantee not only a lack of regard for international law, but guarantee his violations of U.S. law. Tony Blinken, Joe Biden's senior advisor, stated he, Biden, would not tie military assistance to Israel to any political decisions that it makes. Period. Full stop. He said it. He's committed to it. Holy fuckamole. Of course, Kamala Harris has reaffirmed the sentiments communicated by Blinken. Harris stated in a virtual event on August 26th, Joe Biden has made it clear he will not tie security assistance to any political decisions that Israel makes, and I couldn't agree more. These various statements should have struck many as more problematic than they did. After all, they are pledging to break the law for Israel. In 1998, the first of what are known as the Leahy laws were established by Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, the first institution of which resides in the Foreign Assistance Act, FAA, of 1961 in Section 620M, the second of which resides in the Department of Defense Appropriations Bill / the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2014. Essentially, the law states that foreign military assistance must be suspended or discontinued if there exists credible information that the recipient Foreign Security Force unit has committed a gross human rights violation. A gross human rights violation is defined by the FAA as cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, prolonged detention without charges and trial, causing the disappearance of persons by the abduction and clandestine detention of those persons, and other flagrant denial of the right to life, liberty, or the security of person. Since 1946, the American government has provided billions in military aid to Israel, as well as billions in loan guarantees to help Israel develop its qualitative military edge, which it uses to almost exclusively torment and slaughter Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Whether that be to fund Israeli prisons, where an approximate 700 Palestinian children are prosecuted each year, over 75% of whom report being tortured and physically abused, the white phosphorus which rains over Gaza, or the bullets that murder and disable thousands of peaceful Palestinian demonstrators. In theory, a single violation is enough to have military aid revoked from the violating unit, as per the Leahy laws. And the most reputable of human rights organizations have reported Israel's violations extensively. However, aid packages to Israel have only increased annually with the help of Joe Biden, yet only a single publicly known investigation has ever taken place against Israel in 2006, even though the very author of the law, Senator Leahy, requested that the State Department investigate Israeli human rights violations in 2016. In 2017 and again in 2019, Minnesota Representative Betty McCollum drafted a bill now classified under House Resolution 2407, promoting human rights for Palestinian children living under Israeli Military Occupation Act. The bill employs the Leahy laws to argue for an inclusion of the issue of Palestinian youth forced to stand before Israeli military courts into the legislation, and therefore revoke aid from Israeli military and police units which conduct these practices. In August of this year, Representative McCollum has similarly released House Resolution 8050, Israeli Annexation Non-Recognition Act, which vows to revoke aid from Israel that could be used to directly or indirectly assist the annexation of Palestinian land in the West Bank. This legislation has garnered more and more support from representatives around the country, including Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ilhan Omar, reserving a space for Palestine in American politics. Yet, unfortunately, the conversation amongst electoral candidates remains uninformed, trivial, and dangerous. Regardless of who prevails in November, both candidates undoubtedly have an unshakable commitment to the apartheid regime that is Israel and must be held to U.S. law at the very least. This is not about electability, but complicity in crimes against humanity, and American voters have every right to raise their standards. This is me talking. If we're supposed to be holding our government accountable, then we suck just as bad as they do. If this is really bothering anybody, then we need to get busy and pull down the plutocrats who are foisting this on us and on the world, and more particularly on Palestine. And we'll close with this Matthew John article. The 2001 terrorist attack on American soil wasn't the only 9/11. The 2001 terrorist attack on American soil was monstrous and tragic beyond words, but unfortunately it wasn't the first 9/11. On September 11, 1973, a CIA-backed military coup ousted Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of Chile, paving the way for 2 decades of brutal dictatorship under the rule of General Augusto Pinochet. More than 3,000 people were murdered by Pinochet's regime, and approximately 32,000 were tortured. During this tyranny, Chile was part of a broad network of Latin American despots and death squads known as Operation Condor, which was assisted by a CIA base in Panama. This episode is but one example of violent American hegemony that has contributed to global resentment and even blowback, such as the aforementioned terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001. In a series of interviews, published as a small book entitled 9/11, famous linguist and political dissident Noam Chomsky discussed terrorism as a global phenomenon, including the Western double standard regarding the term. By detailing an array of examples such as Kosovo, Nicaragua, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and Sudan, Chomsky observed that, based on the conventional definition of the word, the U.S. is a top global purveyor of terror. The immediate death, destruction, trauma, and misery caused by this vicious tactic is abhorrent, but this violence can also perpetuate itself, often continuing for generations. Regarding the 9/11 attacks and the origins of Al-Qaeda specifically, Chomsky explained, the CIA did have a role, a major role in fact, but that was in the late 1980s when it joined Pakistani intelligence and others, Saudi Arabia, Britain, etc., in recruiting, training, and arming the most extreme Islamic fundamentalists it could find to fight a holy war against the Russian invaders of Afghanistan. The term blowback was coined by the CIA to describe the unintended consequences of covert actions undertaken by the U.S. military and intelligence agencies. The word was first used in this context during internal speculation after the agency helped overthrow the Iranian government in 1953, which I summarized in a previous article. In his groundbreaking expose of said phenomenon, the late Chalmers Johnson vividly chronicled the far-reaching tentacles of the post-war American empire. He explained how this multifaceted hegemony causes profound resentment and hatred throughout the world, sometimes even leading to cases of blowback. Such incidents have included terrorist bombings against Americans abroad, with targets like U.S. embassies in Africa, a Pan Am flight above Lockerbie, Scotland, and an apartment building in Saudi Arabia that housed American soldiers. Blowback also includes organizations and foreign leaders whom were once armed and or supported by the U.S., later becoming enemies of the U.S., as was the case with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And the presence of roughly 700 American military bases in 130 different countries only seems to fan these flames. A post-9/11 manifestation of blowback was the formation of the gruesome terrorist organization known as ISIS, which was only possible thanks to the US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq. Though ISIS committed shocking acts of violence, this outcome wasn't shocking at all. It was entirely predictable based on the US military's own research. In 2004, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld requested a report from the Defense Science Board Task Force regarding the efficacy of American policy in the Middle East. The task force's response included the following. American direct intervention in the Muslim world has paradoxically elevated the stature of and support for radical Islamists, while diminishing support for the U.S. to single digits in some Arab societies. In the eyes of Muslims, American occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq has not led to democracy there, but only more chaos and suffering. Muslims do not hate our freedom, but rather they hate our policies. This unsavory yet sober analysis of our incendiary role in foreign conflicts is often omitted from mainstream discourse because it is profoundly embarrassing to many prominent institutions and public officials. Acknowledging our own role in perpetuating mass violence calls into question the popular notions of American exceptionalism and American moral benevolence. President George W. Bush's explanation of the events of September 11, 2001, which occurred early in his first term, revolved around the phrase, "They hate our freedoms." Bush's evaluation was vastly different from the words of the actual perpetrator, Osama bin Laden, who outlined his motives in a detailed letter to America. Though the missive is laced with Wahhabi rhetoric, it also elucidates bin Laden's political grievances, including verification that 9/11 should be categorized as blowback. Bin Laden's objections to U.S. policy included its support for the Israeli occupation of Palestine, including the killing of civilians and destruction of homes, its sanctions against Iraq, resulting in at least 500,000 civilian deaths, its military bases throughout the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia, its military actions in Somalia, and its support for regimes that have killed and oppressed Muslims throughout the world. This al-Qaeda kingpin may have been an extremist and a mass murderer, but his explanation certainly holds more water than Bush's glib retort. The devastation caused by the 9/11 attacks inspired a beautiful outpouring of support and solidarity among people from all backgrounds coming together to assist and comfort one another. However, the aftermath of this atrocity also unleashed pervasive nationalism, ethnic and religious profiling, violations of constitutional rights, and imperialistic mass murder in the Middle East. The 9/11 slogan became "Never Forget." As a nation, we certainly won't forget such a large-scale catastrophe, but in a sense, we also never remember. Instead of starting the timeline only when an event affects us directly, we should analyze the historical context of such events and have the courage to look in the mirror and see our decades of relentless global violence, both covert and overt. We should also, as participants in a democracy, evaluate our role in the profound suffering, sorrow, resentment, and blowback these policies have generated. The Korean War may help put this in perspective. American military aggression in North Korea between 1950 and 1953 resulted in the equivalent of hundreds of 9/11s based on the respective death tolls. The same is true of American aggression in Southeast Asia during the 1960s and 70s. In recent decades, the so-called War on Terror has taken the lives of approximately 1.3 million people. The scope of these blood-drenched foreign conquests, combined with consistent historic U.S. support for dictatorships and death squads, makes it easy to see why America is widely perceived as the greatest threat to world peace. On this harrowing anniversary, let's honor the victims of September 11th, 2001 by remembering the victims of our own terrorism as well. If we change our ways, we can address the root causes of these conflicts and prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Let's acknowledge our history, confront our current complicity in mass murder, and work to end this cycle of violence. And I'll conclude with the thought that I keep coming back to. You can't achieve these ends by voting for more of the same of what we've had for the last 40 years. We have to stop condoning violence by refusing to vote for either Republicans or Democrats. So you can do what George Carlin did and not vote, or you can vote for someone else that matches your values, someone, say, in the Green Party. In short, if you are not willing to withhold your vote from U.S. hegemony and U.S. climate destruction, then you suck.